Andreas Umland, who's an analyst at the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Anders, thank you so much for your time. I understand you were recently in Ukraine. When did you leave Kiev?
I left by accident shortly before the war to visit my parents here in Germany, but I have been living in Ukraine for the last 20 years.
Were you expecting the Russian attack? I mean, the build-up had been happening for a while. People were wondering whether the Americans were right in their assessment that the order had been given well before the first wave of Russian troops arrived in Ukrainian territory. Were you thinking that it was a done deal, that this was going to happen?
We published with a colleague 3 scenarios where we actually foresaw also a large escalation, not only a minor escalation that was indeed very much expected, but the viciousness of the current attack still surprises me. And there's now active talk among many experts that at some point Russia might be even ready to use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine to get a capitulation from Ukraine. And that's maybe also the background for Zelensky's recently more sort of compromising rhetoric.
Andreas, where does that assessment come from? The Americans have said recently that they don't believe that Vladimir Putin will use a nuclear weapon, that it's just a threat.
I think there are 2 kinds of using nuclear weapon. I don't think that there is a serious nuclear threat for NATO. We've seen that in the past behavior of Russia that, for instance, when there was this, in 2015, this incident when Turkey shot down a Russian fighter plane, that Russia wants to avoid a conflict with NATO. But within Ukraine, which is not NATO territory, many analysts have already sort of predicted that at some point Putin could go as far as using a tactical nuclear weapon to basically bomb Ukraine into a capitulation, to generate something like a Hiroshima effect, if you like. So to get then basically Ukraine do whatever he wants.
Are you in agreement with Amnesty International, also Human Rights Watch, that Russia has been using cluster bombs and is committing war crimes?
Well, if the competent organizations are saying so, I'm not on the spot. I can also only rely here on the published material. And this is actually a pattern that we've seen already before. Grozny was made into a city of ruins in the early 2000s. We've seen that in Aleppo, in Homs, in Idlib. So this wouldn't surprise me much.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Grozny, you mentioned Aleppo. This tactic of the Russians during the Syrian war of opening a humanitarian corridor and then attacking the people who are leaving, but blaming it on local actors. Many people are saying that's exactly what's happening now in Ukraine. And we have shortly more humanitarian corridors across most of the cities where they were also open on Tuesday, about to reopen again. What is Russia's thinking here in terms of how it's treating those people who are trying to leave? These are civilians.
Yes, but in the sort of cold-blooded calculations of the Russian leadership, these are opportunities to actually inflict terror on the enemy and to use then this terrorized state of the enemy to get an agreement that is in Russia's favor. We've seen that in 2014, when there was also a corridor for the Ukrainian troops to leave Ilovaisk, and then this corridor was attacked. We've seen that in 2015, also when the second Minsk agreement was signed, that usually before these agreements, Russia uses terror to get an as good as possible agreement, and whatever the costs.
Andreas, what do you think is realistically the way out of the current situation? I mean, are we looking at a situation where Russia destroys so much infrastructure and subjugates the population and terrorizes them, as you've been saying, to the extent that the people eventually look to the president and say, you have to concede here, we can't take any more?
That's very difficult to predict because so far, at least, the effect of the Russian campaign, the Russian war in Ukraine has been the opposite, that the mood has rather become more hawkish, if you like, and the unity of the country has increased and the readiness for compromise has decreased. But indeed, if there is really a bombing campaign, or as I mentioned, a use of even a nuclear weapon or nuclear ammunition in Ukraine, then indeed people could say, well, we have to save at least physically ourselves, and then there may be readiness to some sort of concessions and compromise.
Andreas Umland is from the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Really appreciate your time, Andreas. Thank you.